Husband finally cut off his toxic mom and sis when they had the audacity to demand we give up our dream house for my jobless Sil, her deadbeat gaming addict husband, and their 6 kids. Hello everyone. My in-laws have a very toxic relationship with my husband, and it's starting to affect my life. You see, while growing up, my husband Jacob used to be the favorite golden child, and his mom Mill was extremely close to him. Jacob has told me that because his dad used to be quite busy with work, he and his mother spent a lot of time together. But I've noticed that his sister, Sarah, we'll call her Sil for simplicity, isn't treated the same by Mill. Although I'm sure Mill loves both her children, I've noticed time and time again that she favors Jacob more. I'm certain Sil must have felt this growing up, which is why Jacob has always tried to fill the role by being a good older brother to her, and always being there for her. But here's the thing, both Sil and Mill would sometimes behave so absurdly that it crossed the line. For example, when Jacob and I first started dating, he was still a fresh college graduate, and his family, including Sil, lived in the same house. My in-laws had given Jacob an entirely different floor so he could have his own privacy and invite whoever he wanted. This is why he would sometimes invite me over to spend the night with him. However, on several occasions during the morning, Sil would barge into our room while we were sleeping, without knocking. As you can imagine, sometimes we weren't even properly dressed, but she would act like it was completely normal and start talking to Jacob about very random things. This was extremely weird for me, as I was uncomfortable with her seeing me in my lingerie. Before anyone points it out, I completely understand that Jacob lived with his family at the time, so I should have expected this, but is knocking on the door before entering a room really too much to ask? I guess sometimes siblings can be very close, but she and I didn't know each other that well when Jacob and I first started dating, so I found it extremely disrespectful. Naturally, I talked to Jacob about it and told him I wouldn't be coming over unless he installed a lock on his door. He agreed. But as you can imagine, the next morning, Sil tried to barge in unsuccessfully and started yelling at us about why we had the door locked. She began jiggling the handle and banging on it, demanding Jacob let her in. He finally opened the door, and she stormed into the room, questioning why he had installed the lock in the first place. When she noticed me, she pointed at me and started yelling, "Is it because of this skank?" I was shocked at how rude and disrespectful she sounded. Jacob told her that he was the one who wanted to install the lock, but Sil wasn't convinced. She angrily told him that they were siblings and shouldn't have any secrets between them. Jacob explained that he didn't have any secrets, but had installed the lock so she wouldn't barge in while we were sleeping, as it was really disturbing. Hearing this, Sil angrily flipped her head toward me and yelled that this was all my fault, and that I was coming between her and her brother. This all seemed a bit too much for me since I'm very non-confrontational, so I excused myself to go to the washroom. I could hear her continuing to yell and Jacob trying to pacify her. When she was finally gone, he came in to comfort me. He was apologetic for her behavior and assured me he would talk to her again, so she would apologize to me as well. The next weekend when I came over, she apologized to me and gave me a very pathetic excuse. She needed to talk to Jacob very urgently about something, so she thought it would be okay to come in. Jacob firmly asked her not to disturb us again, and she nodded meekly. Although this issue was solved, it wasn't her only weird behavior toward Jacob. If Jacob and I disagreed on something, even small things like movies, and Sil was around, she would start telling him how he should date someone with similar tastes and that we were clearly wrong for each other. Jacob would shoot her a disapproving look, but she would just smirk. Another incident was when she would ask me uncomfortable questions about my past, trying to dig into my life. Jacob and I had been honest about each other's past from the very beginning, but I didn't feel comfortable sharing it with his sister. Regardless of my feelings, she would ask me things like, "Why did your ex break up with you? Were you not good enough for him?" Or make comments like, "My brother's past girlfriend was so much prettier than you." All of these questions and comments would come up whenever she and I were left alone. I slowly started to suspect that she was trying to play this game with me and put me down. Initially, I kept my mouth shut, but over time, when it continued, I finally had enough. One day, I replied to her taunt by saying how I liked my ex-boyfriend's family more than Jacob's family, since my ex didn't have nosy, overbearing family members. Sil looked surprised at my reaction, and this seemed to shut her up for a while. What I had told her was basically true. Even though Sil had a weird relationship with my husband, Mill was no better. When I first came into Jacob's life, Mill would ignore me. But once she realized that Jacob and I were getting serious, she started behaving like I was trying to steal her son away from her. She would purposefully ignore me at dinner or during family functions and act like I didn't exist. Jacob sometimes noticed this and would try to talk to her about it, but she never changed. Mill once even called me stuck up and spoiled, just because my parents sent me to a private school, and she was a public school teacher. I even know she tried to talk Jacob out of marrying me, telling him to keep looking for a better partner than me. Fortunately, my husband didn't care about her opinion and proposed to me anyway. When Mill and Sil found out that Jacob had proposed, they freaked out. Both of them called to tell me that perhaps this was a bad decision, and since Jacob wouldn't listen to them, I should end the relationship and give him back the ring. I found it very weird and refused, telling them they were crossing a line by asking me to do something like this when I loved Jacob and wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. When they realized they couldn't convince me, Mill changed her tune and begrudgingly told me that I should strive to be the best wife for him and take care of him the way she had taken care of him all these years. I was a bit offended, but tried not to take more offense to her words. Sil, on the other hand, told me that I was clearly just a gold digger and that her brother deserved someone much more of his status. She threatened that she would make sure to expose me before our marriage so that Jacob would never marry me. After this conversation, I immediately talked to Jacob about everything, and he was taken aback at how rude they were toward me. He fought with them over this, but both Mill and Sil stuck to their claim that I wasn't good enough for him. He told me to ignore them and that he loved me regardless of what they thought. Although his words were comforting, I did feel bad that his own family wouldn't accept me. Jacob and I had already decided to pay for our own wedding, so when Mill offered to pay for half of our expenses, we declined graciously, with Jacob telling her how hard we had worked to save money just for this occasion. Instead of being happy for us, this made her even more upset, and she started telling Jacob how sad she was that he didn't need her anymore. But Jacob's dad seemed very proud of us. Unlike his sister and mother, his dad was quite cool-headed and never had a problem with our relationship. Since Mill continued to complain to Jacob, we compromised by telling her that we would love it if she wanted to organize the rehearsal dinner for us. She agreed, and we appreciated the gesture. However, as the wedding approached, things took an unexpected turn. The first incident was when Sil invited herself to have dinner with us, telling Jacob how much she missed him. By this time, Jacob and I were living on our own after our engagement, so we thought she genuinely wanted to spend time with her brother. We agreed, and Jacob asked me clearly if I was okay with having dinner with her. I begrudgingly agreed, as I didn't want to be rude to my soon-to-be sister-in-law. While we were having a good meal, Sil, seemingly out of the blue, started talking about how she absolutely detested cheating partners, and that cheaters were nothing but useless pieces of trash. We looked at her curiously, wondering where she was going with this. Then Sil looked me square in the face and asked me how it felt to be a useless piece of trash. My brows furrowed in confusion, and then Sil began to yell, accusing me of having an affair with my co-worker Zach. Jacob asked her what she meant by that, and Sil triumphantly began pulling out pictures of me and one of my co-workers, waving them around and insisting that she had caught me red-handed. I already knew I had never been unfaithful to Jacob since we started dating, so I was curious as to why she thought I was having an affair with my co-worker. Looking through the pictures, they looked quite harmless. It's true Zach and I were close co-workers, but it was only because we had both started at the company at the same time and helped each other whenever we made mistakes, so that our boss didn't reprimand us later. Zach even had a girlfriend, and Jacob knew about that. I don't have a lock on my phone, and I had always been quite upfront with Jacob about all my co-workers. These casual moments captured in the photos were twisted by Sil into something they were not, evidence of an imaginary affair. In reality, it was far from her unfounded accusations, and I felt a surge of annoyance at her attempts to tarnish my integrity and strain my relationship with Jacob. Before I could speak to defend myself, Jacob, shocked and visibly upset, stepped in for me. He asked Sil why she was following me around and taking pictures of me with my co-workers at various public places without anyone's consent. Hearing this, Sil started justifying that she only wanted to investigate me since I wasn't of their status, and she was afraid that I was marrying him to take away his money. Jacob firmly told her that her claims were baseless and that she was creating unnecessary drama out of nothing. He tried to reason with her, asking her to stop spreading lies and trying to harm our relationship, but Sil kept yelling at him that he should open his eyes to the obvious affair that was going on. I also tried to tell her that we were just co-workers, but she vehemently stuck to her statements. The atmosphere grew tense as her accusations intensified. I had enough of her yelling and baseless claims, so I told Sil that I was going to file a police report against her for illegally taking my pictures and stalking me. Her expression turned petrified as she looked at me and asked if I was serious. I told her that I clearly had all the evidence. She had purposefully stalked me, taken photographs of me with my coworkers without my consent, and was trying to defame me with ridiculous lies. Sil glanced at Jacob, then back at me, and started pleading. She claimed this was all to protect her brother and that she didn't think it was such a big deal. She begged Jacob to talk to me, insisting she had done all this for him and that a police case would ruin her career and future. I firmly told Sil that only she could save herself at this point. When she asked me what I wanted, I said I wouldn't file a case as long as she stayed far away from my life. There was nothing Sil could do to escape the situation. She looked at her brother, but Jacob supported me and told her she should be grateful I was willing to let it go, as what she had done was clearly wrong. Reluctantly, Sil agreed to stay away from me, and since that day, we haven't spoken. Jacob continues to have a relationship with her, but she has never dared to approach me again. Now, the second incident happened just the night before our wedding, during the rehearsal dinner. Mill, who had insisted on taking full responsibility for the dinner, declined our offers to help in any way leading up to the event. She assured us she had everything under control. However, upon arrival, it became clear the preparations were far from what we expected. The rehearsal dinner turned out to be plastic tablecloths on picnic tables and cold Mexican food. Throughout the dinner, Mill acted upset, which made the whole celebration feel off. She got drunk and started behaving inappropriately with the guests, saying she couldn't wait for the wedding to be over and how stressful it had been, even though she hadn't contributed financially or helped with any planning. Eventually, my dad got fed up and escorted her out. My mom tried to protest, attempting to justify Mill's behavior, but my dad refused to listen. As you can imagine, it was a complete disaster. I started freaking out, worried that both Mill and Sil would somehow ruin my wedding the next day. That night, Jacob and I had our first big fight. I told him firmly that he needed to uninvite both Sil and Mill. Given their behavior, it was clear they would do something to upstage us during the wedding. Jacob vehemently refused and tried to assure me that his dad, Phil, would be there to keep them in check. I had to threaten Jacob, saying if he didn't uninvite his mother and sister, there would be no wedding the next day. Jacob was visibly shocked by my demand, and I knew how harsh I sounded, but I was too anxious thinking about what these women might do. I didn't want to be embarrassed in front of my family and friends on my wedding day. Jacob didn't have strong boundaries with them, but I hoped this ultimatum would make him understand how much they were affecting our relationship. Thankfully, Jacob did understand and made the right choice. He called his dad early the next morning and told him that Mill and Sil were uninvited. Phil didn't even seem surprised and assured Jacob he would make sure they didn't show up. Shortly after, Mill and Sil started calling Jacob non-stop, clearly trying to convince him to let them come to the wedding. But Jacob stood firm, telling them that after how they had treated me throughout our relationship, he didn't feel comfortable having them there. Mill started ranting about how I was a terrible woman for coming between him and his mother, and Sil tried to reason with him too, but Jacob stuck to his decision. I did feel bad that Phil couldn't come to the wedding because of his wife and daughter, and I felt guilty about the ultimatum. But all that guilt vanished when I later learned from Jacob's cousins that Sil and Mill had planned to wear white dresses to our wedding. They told me about a family WhatsApp group with only female members, where Sil had encouraged others to wear white too, saying there was no reason for the bride to be the only one in white. I was shocked at how low they were willing to go just to hurt me. After learning this, I was relieved they were uninvited. Jacob did miss his family, but he understood where I was coming from. Overall, we had a great wedding, and no one tried to upstage us. Since that day, Mill and Sil have stopped talking to me completely, which I'm perfectly fine with. They only invite Jacob over for dinner or on special occasions, which I don't mind. Phil, on the other hand, has always been kind to me, and we've stayed in touch over the years. Jacob and I saved meticulously and eventually bought our first home this year. We were thrilled to finally own something so significant. His parents and Sil came to visit for a small housewarming celebration, but to avoid them, I spent the day with my family. Now, coming to the main issue, last month, out of the blue, Sil called me. This was very unexpected, as she and I haven't spoken a single word to each other since the day I married Jacob. Surprisingly, she casually asked how I had been and how my life was going. I was a bit taken aback by her sudden interest, but I answered her questions anyway. Then she started asking how it felt to live in such a big house when it was just me and Jacob. Her words stung because Jacob and I had been trying to get pregnant for a long time, but due to infertility issues, I was unable to conceive. Jacob knew about this, and although we mourned the possibility of never having children of our own, we had eventually accepted it. I had told Jacob several times when I first found out that he was welcome to divorce me if he wanted to marry someone else and have children, but Jacob always stuck by me. He loved me and said it was okay for us to be childless as long as we had each other. Obviously, our families knew about this, which is why Mill subtly brought it up. She then informed me that Sil was pregnant. I was shocked to hear this, as it would be her 6th child. I had heard from Jacob how Sil's husband was jobless, didn't believe in using condoms, and how these accidental pregnancies kept happening. Sil's partner was the epitome of laziness. He did nothing around the house to help her or the kids. Jacob had told me he treated Sil like his personal maid, never paying any bills while she worked multiple part-time jobs. Meanwhile, he spent his days gaming. Despite everyone's advice, Sil never left him. Mill continued, saying that since Sil could no longer work throughout her pregnancy, she thought it would be a good idea for Jacob and me to give up our house. According to Mill, it was too big for a childless couple like us. I was completely taken aback by her demand and struggled to find the words to respond. I asked her if she was joking, but Mill insisted she was serious. She argued that Sil and her husband deserved to live in a bigger house, but since Mill didn't have space at her own place, she wanted them to move in with us. The weight of her announcement hung in the air, and I tried to compose myself amid the whirlwind of emotions. I explained to Mill that this was our house, which we were still paying for. The idea of someone else moving in without even asking our permission was intrusive and ridiculous. However, Mill insisted she had already talked to Jacob, and he had agreed. This seemed bizarre to me because Jacob and I share everything, and I knew for sure he would have told me if he had agreed to let his sister and her family stay with us. I firmly told Mill that since the house belonged to both of us, Jacob couldn't give permission on his own. No one was allowed to live here without both of us agreeing. To compromise, I said I'd be happy to host Sil and her husband for a few days, but they couldn't move in permanently. Mill, on the other hand, started yelling at me, saying that making space for my sister-in-law and her husband was expected of me as a dutiful daughter-in-law. She even claimed that if I agreed, all our past issues would be forgiven. In anger, I replied, "Sure, I'll be happy to let them have our place, but you see we're still paying for it, and I know Sil and her husband won't help with the mortgage or bills. So, I think you should take some responsibility and help pay for Sil, her husband, and her children to live here. I'd be happy if you could just cover the mortgage and we'll handle the bills, but since you only have one job, tell me, when are you getting a second job to pay off the debt?" Hearing this, Mill erupted in a fit of rage, shouting and expressing her displeasure. She called it ridiculous for me to ask her to pay the mortgage. I retorted that it was equally ridiculous for her to expect us to take care of Sil's family and let them move in. This pissed her off even more, and she continued yelling while I smiled in satisfaction. She eventually hung up when she realized I wasn't going to give in. Soon after, Sil called, yelling at me for daring to ask her mother to pay our mortgage. She accused me of being a gold digger, and I fired back, saying she was the gold digger for trying to live with us. I told her if she wanted to see the real gold digger in the family, she should look at her own partner, who did nothing to help her. That seemed to shut her up. I firmly told her she could bicker with me all she wanted, but I would never allow her family into our house unless they helped with the mortgage. She accused me of being heartless and prioritizing money over family, but the tables had turned. I felt relieved standing up for myself and regaining control of my home. However, I do feel a bit guilty thinking about my husband, and I'm here on Reddit wondering if what I've done makes me the bad guy. Hello everyone. To keep this video going, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and helps us continue bringing you great stories. So if you enjoy our content, Take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support makes a huge difference. Alright, let's keep going. Update 1. Thank you to everyone who has shown their support. To answer the most important question everyone keeps asking, why would Mill even demand such a ridiculous thing from us? It's because Mill has always been this entitled. Clearly, my husband has let this charade go on for far too long, and he and I need to sit down and have a serious talk about it. It's pathetic how Mill can lie about her own son just to get her way. Sil is just a pawn in her game, going along with whatever her mom wants, because Mill has always heavily favored my husband. Sil listens to her mommy in the hopes that Mill will favor her too. In this case, Sil stood to gain since she could depend on us to pay her bills and take care of her kids while her worthless husband did nothing. I'm waiting for my husband to return from his business trip so we can talk. I don't want to discuss this over the phone. It's too important. Update 2. It's been 3 days since my last update. As I mentioned earlier, I was waiting for my husband to return. When he got back, we finally sat down to talk. I told him how his mother had called me, demanding we give up our house for his sister and her family. Jacob was clearly taken aback. I went on to tell him the entire story, and he confessed he had no idea about any of it. The only thing Mill had told him before his trip was that Sil was pregnant. That's all he knew. He had no idea she would make such ridiculous demands. I told him firmly that I expected him to talk to Mill and deal with the situation, since I couldn't handle his family anymore. He agreed. He called Mill in front of me and asked her why she had lied to me about him. Caught red-handed, Mill tried to backtrack, saying she didn't exactly lie. She just assumed he'd have no problem with Sil living with us, so she took matters into her own hands. Jacob stopped her mid-sentence and asked why she assumed he'd be okay with Sil and her entire family moving in. Mill said that since he and Sil were close, he'd obviously want to help her out by letting her family move in. I closed my eyes in frustration, but kept my mouth shut. Jacob needed to handle this. My husband firmly told her there was no way he was letting Sil, her jobless husband, and their 6 kids move in with us. He said she had no right to force us to take care of them. Mill started yelling that Sil really needed help, but Jacob told her it wasn't our responsibility. If she cared so much, she should take care of Sil herself. Mill then said Phil didn't want Sil moving in with them because their house was too small, but since we lived in a big house, we could easily help out. She even had the audacity to say that since I was childless, I could help raise Sil's kids, and it would make me feel fulfilled. My eyes widened in shock, but for the first time, I watched my husband's face change color. He yelled back at her, saying she had no right to say something so insensitive about me, and that she couldn't use my infertility against me to force me to take care of Sil's kids. He continued, telling her Phil rightfully didn't want anything to do with Sil, since she had become a child-birthing machine, and he was done with both of them. Mill tried to backtrack, but Jacob kept yelling, saying he had tried his best to have a good relationship with them even after they continuously disrespected me, but he couldn't take it anymore. Mill started begging, but Jacob told her this was our house, I was his wife, and anyone who disrespected me disrespected him too. With those final words, Jacob hung up. Since then, he's had no contact with Sil or Mill. Phil did call to talk to him, but after learning what happened, he understood why Jacob made such a drastic decision. Phil even apologized to me on behalf of his wife, but I told him it wasn't his fault. Update 3. It's been an interesting 2 weeks. A lot of people suggested I install cameras around my place in case Mill and Sil decided to show up and cause a scene, so I ordered them online and set them up all around the house. Well, as luck would have it, they did show up last weekend, knocking on my door while I was home alone. When I saw them on the camera, I called Jacob immediately, and he said he was on his way. I opened the door, and there they were, Mill and Sil, looking furious. They demanded I let them in, but I stood my ground, refusing to allow them entry. I told them if they had anything to talk about, they could do it from outside. Mill started yelling about how heartless I was, accusing me of being greedy and selfish. I calmly told her this was our home, and they had no right to barge in uninvited. Mill continued her tirade, completely unaware the cameras were capturing every moment. I calmly reminded her of our previous conversation, reiterating that I would not be giving up my home for Sil and her husband, and if she had anything further to discuss, she should wait for Jacob to come home. Sil, in turn, started yelling that I was breaking up the family for no reason and that I was being too stubborn. She told me I wasn't just a gold digger, like she'd always known, but now I was trying to take her brother away from them. That's when I informed them that everything they were saying was being recorded on our cameras, and I'd be using this evidence to get a restraining order against them. I warned them that next time, they wouldn't be able to come within 50 feet of our house. Their eyes widened in shock, and Mill yelled that I wouldn't dare do that. I smirked and told her if they didn't leave our property that very minute, she'd be receiving a legal notice soon. That scared them straight. Sil started saying I was overreacting and that it wasn't a big deal. Fortunately, at that point, Jacob arrived. He walked over calmly and asked Mill what they were doing there. She rushed to hug him, but he deflected her and firmly asked again what she and Sil were doing here. Sil started saying they knew it was me trying to control his life by not letting him talk to them and that they'd come to confront me. I rolled my eyes at how absurd they sounded. Jacob clarified to both of them that he was the one who had decided to go no contact and that he didn't want anything to do with them. Mill started begging him to forgive her, but he simply asked them to leave the property or he'd have no choice but to call the police. Their eyes widened in shock. Clearly, they hadn't expected this reaction from him. Jacob went on to tell them that if they ever showed up at our house again, he and I would call the police and have them removed forcefully. They looked devastated, but Jacob didn't care anymore. I felt relieved that my husband was finally standing up for me. Eventually, both of them left, still fuming. Since then, Jacob has talked to Phil, who was as shocked as we were that Mill and Sil had gone behind his back to show up at our house unannounced. Phil assured us we were right not to let them in, and he's becoming increasingly frustrated with their behavior. I know that with Jacob being so firm and kicking them out, they won't dare set foot on our property again. If they do, I'll contact a lawyer and send them a notice immediately. I'm glad my husband has finally realized how toxic his family is, and hopefully, they won't trouble us anymore, so we can live our lives in peace. I hope this is my last update, because I'm ready to move on from this situation.